Hi everyone, my name is Brittany J. Jones. In this video, I am going to be sewing along to the new McCall's pattern 8312. It is a missus dress and I will be sewing view C from the pattern. I used 100% cotton fabric. I'm actually wearing a dress right now. This is a dress. I used a gingham, which is 100% cotton fabric, and I cut the size 14. Let's go over the pattern pieces that we're going to need to cut to make view C of this pattern. Again, we're going to be sewing McCall's 8312. I will be following along with view C on this pattern. If you have any questions as far as the fabric that would be best for it, on the back of the pattern envelope, you have a list of suggested fabrics here. After you have decided on your body measurements, before you cut out your pattern, be sure to take a look down at the finished garment measurements. There is a lot of ease in this design, so you want to make sure that you are cutting the size that you prefer. Let's review the pattern pieces that you will need to cut out. You will need to cut out pattern piece number 1. This is the bodice front. You will cut 2 on fold. You need to cut out pattern piece number 2. This is the bodice back. You will need to cut 2 on the fold. Pattern piece number 3. This is the sleeve. You will need to cut 2. Pattern piece number 4, this is the skirt front. You will cut 1 on the fold. Pattern piece number 5, this is the skirt back. You will cut 1 on the fold. Pattern piece number 6, this is the pocket. We need to cut 4. And pattern piece number 8, this is the cuff. We need to cut 2. To begin, we want to take our bodice front and our bodice back, and we want to pin at the shoulders. So with right sides facing, you want to go ahead, match up your shoulders and pin. Match up your notches. I'm going to pin there. Once you have it pinned, you want to go ahead and stitch at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. You're going to do the same exact thing to the bodice facing, so you should have cut out 2 of the front and 2 of the back bodice. We're going to pin these at the shoulders as well and go ahead and stitch them now. Now that we have the bodice and the facing sewn at the shoulders, we can go ahead and put them right sides together and stitch around the neckline. So I'm going to put them right sides facing. I'm going to match up my shoulders and pin. And I'm going to pin around the remaining neckline. Once you have the neckline pinned, we can go ahead and stitch in a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once you get down here to your dot that you transferred, you want to put your needle down and pivot and then stitch up the other side. So let's go ahead and sew our neckline in place now. Now that we have sewn the bodice and facing together around the neckline, we can go ahead and clip down here to the point and also trim our seam. We can also clip back here into the curves as well. So I'm going to clip down to my stitching. Be sure not to clip through it, just to it. And trim your seam allowance. I'm trimming mine down to about 1/4 of an inch. Once you have it trimmed, you can go ahead and flip your facing to the inside, and we can go ahead and press this in place. Once you have it turned to the inside, the instructions do not state to do understitching, but if you prefer, if that's like a preference for you and you want to do understitching, you can do it along the facing. Just make sure you have your seam allowance facing toward the facing, and then you can do the understitching. After you have it pressed, then go ahead and baste all of your raw edges together. Now that we have the bodice basted all the way around the edges, if you do have a label that you like to insert into your garments, I do recommend doing it before you do the basting. That way you can stitch it onto your facing without the stitching showing on the outside of your garment. Again, totally optional. Now let's move on to the next step. Next, we're going to start working on our sleeve, and we need to gather between our large dot. So we're going to do 2 rows of gathering stitches all the way along the top of the sleeves. If you do prefer to use yarn, this is a great time to go ahead and pull that out, and you can do your gathering stitches using yarn. I'm actually going to use yarn myself. With yarn, you just want to make sure that you have a piece that's longer than what you're going to be gathering up. So I'm just going to do like a quick measure of this. I'm going to grab a pin, and I'm going to put it right here at my large dot. And with this excess yarn, I'm just going to do a figure 8 around the pin. I just want to hold it in place while I am doing the zigzag stitch over the yarn to gather it up. Once I have this all done, I'll be able to just pull on the yarn to gather up the whole top of the sleeve. This is optional. You can just do 2 rows of gathering stitches using your basting stitch on your machine if you prefer to do that method. But I'm going to go ahead and use the yarn now. So let's go ahead, and again, between both of the large circles, we're going to gather the upper edge of our sleeve. We're also going to gather the lower edge of our sleeve, but first we're going to stitch the seam together and we'll gather that. So now I'm going to go to the sewing machine. I'm going to lengthen out my stitch width as well as my stitch length so that it goes over the yarn cleanly, and then I'm going to gather up the fabric. When gathering with yarn, I like to place my yarn at about 1/2 inch, not directly on my 5/8 inch seam line. And since I am basting, I don't need to backstitch, and I'm just going to do a zigzag stitch over the yarn. Again, I've lengthened out my stitch width as well as my stitch length. Right now my width is at an 8.0 and my length is at a 10.0. Okay, I have the gathering stitch along the upper portion of my sleeve. Here's a closer look at that here. I had the yarn lined up with the center of my presser foot, and I just did a zigzag stitch around the yarn, making sure I did not stitch in the yarn. I lengthened out my stitch as well as my width, and this is what that looks like. Now let's move on to stitching the sleeve. So with right sides facing, we're going to place our underarm seam together, and we're going to pin below the large circle that we transferred. So for the dot that you transferred, place a pin there, and we're going to pin below that. We're going to pin the other side the same way. So this should be open here, and only from the small dot down should be pinned. So this is where we're going to be stitching, back stitch at the beginning and at the end. Be sure to change your stitch back to a regular machine stitch. Once you have stitched down your underarm seam for your sleeve, you want to go ahead and give that a press, and then you want to gather the lower edge of your sleeve the same way that you did for the top. I've gone ahead and did the yarn gathering method down here as well. We're going to go ahead and put this to the side now and start to work on the cuffs. For the cuffs, with the right sides facing, you want to fold your cuff in half like so. You should have transferred a notch. You want to pin in place. And we're going to stitch it down at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Once you have stitched your cuff in place, you want to go ahead and press that seam flat. And then on the unnotched edge, you want to press up 5/8 inch. So that's what I've done here. I've pressed up 5/8 inch on my unnotched edge. And so now I'm going to go ahead and trim this down to 3/8 inch. I did that for both of them. So you go ahead and again, after you stitched it, press your seam flat and fold up 5/8 inch on your unnotched edge and trim it down to 3/8 inch. After we have it trimmed, now we want to go ahead and pin the notched edge to the lower edge of the sleeve. With the right sides facing, first we're going to match up our seam and pin there first. So now we can adjust our gathers to fit the cuff, and you should have also transferred a notch at the lower edge of your sleeve that matches up to the cuff. So go ahead and find that notch and pin it in place. After both of your cuffs have been pinned, now we can go to the sewing machine and you want to go ahead and stitch them in place at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. After you have stitched on your cuff, you can go ahead and remove your basting stitch. So I'm just going to pull on one end of my yarn here. And my gathers are still intact. So now we can go ahead and trim down our seam. After you have trimmed the seam, now you want to fold over your cuff, right over your seam line like so, and you want to go ahead and pin it in place, and then you can slip stitch it or you can stitch in the ditch. I'm actually going to do that for mine, so I'm going to do a stitch in the ditch for mine. So again, you just want to fold up the pressed edge right over your seam line, pin that in place, and then go ahead and slip stitch it or do a stitch in the ditch. Once you have your cuffs sewn on, now we can go ahead and install them to the bodice. So with right sides facing, you want to adjust your gathers, matching up your circles as well as your notches. So the double notch is for the back, the single notch goes to the front. I'm going to match up my circles, my notches, and then I'm going to adjust my gathers so that everything fits, and I'm going to pin it in place. Continue to pull up on your gathering stitches, whether you did 2 rows or if you're using yarn as well. Go ahead and continue to gather till everything fits, and then you can distribute your gathers and just continue pinning in place. Now that we have the sleeve pinned in, we can go to the sewing machine. We're going to stitch it in a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. If you have a serger, after you have it stitched, you can go ahead and finish off your seam allowance with your serger. If you do not have a serger, after you have done your 5/8 of an inch stitch, you can stitch again at a 1/4 of an inch inside of the seam allowance, and then you can trim close to that second stitching. Let's go ahead and stitch it in place now. Once you have your gathers installed, you want to go ahead and finish off your seam allowance and cut away any loose threads that you have. I'm going to clip away a few of mine right here, and then press your seams going toward the bodice. After you have that done, we can put this to the side and start to work on the skirt. For both of the skirt pieces, piece 4 and 5, we are going to gather between the large circles that you transferred. So you want to gather right between these circles, again on pattern piece number 4 and 5. So go ahead and do your gathering rows of stitches now. Once you have your gathering stitch installed, again, you could have done 2 rows of basting stitches or using yarn. We can go ahead and install our pockets. So with the right sides facing, you want to match up your notch. And you can look, you should have transferred circles on the wrong side. So just match up your notch, and we're going to pin that in place. We're going to do that both for both sides of the front as well as the same for the back. So go ahead and grab your pins, and you want to pin in place. Okay, once you have it pinned, we're going to stitch in a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, so back stitch at the beginning and at the end. Once you have your pockets sewn on, you want to go ahead and give them a press. Press them out and have your seam allowance facing toward your pockets. Next, with right sides facing, we're going to lay the front and back together. We're going to pin down our side seam. We're also going to pin around our pockets. So let's go ahead and pin now.
Okay, once you have it pinned in place, we're going to go to the sewing machine. We're going to back stitch at the beginning, and we're going to stitch down to this first dot here. We'll back stitch there and cut our thread. You then want to come down to the next dot, back stitch here, and stitch all the way down to the remaining seam, back stitch at the end. Make sure that you leave this open for your pocket, and then you just want to stitch around your pocket. So let's go ahead and do the stitching now on both sides of our skirt. Once you have your pockets sewn on, you want to clip on the back seam allowance only below and above the pocket. So here's a close-up of what I mean. Back seam allowance only, you want to clip it and then press your pocket toward the front. I went ahead and pressed the remainder of my seam flat. The next thing that we want to do is go ahead and grab our bodice, and we're going to pin it to our skirt, matching up our notches and our circles. Okay, I have pinned my bodice and sleeve to my skirt. Right here at the dots, I made sure to pull up on my gathers to gather those in, and I pinned it in place. So what I would do is I would move my seam allowance to one side and begin stitching at this dot. Then I would go to the other side, stop at that dot, and you want to move your seam allowance over so that you're starting and stopping right at your dots. So that's what we're going to do to connect our bodice to our skirt. So on these sides here, make sure that you start at a dot, and then when you come back around, move your seam allowance over so that you are ending at a dot. So let's go ahead and stitch it in place. I'm gonna base mine in place first, and then I'll do a permanent stitch. Okay, I have basted my bodice to my skirt. I wanna take a look at how everything looks first. So I'm gonna leave my gathering stitches in and just flip everything right side out. Okay, so with right sides facing, this is how my side seams are looking. I'm gonna clean this one up a little bit more, so I'm gonna undo my basting stitch and just come back over here and just make sure that I'm stopping directly at that point. But overall, everything looks really good. I like the gathers here. So I'm just gonna make that adjustment on this side. I can see that I kind of went past my stitch, so I'm gonna fix that. And then I put in my permanent stitch and finish off my seam allowance. And I'm just gonna show you all another look at what mine looks like on the inside here. So I matched up the dots here with the gathers to the bodice. And then on the side, this is the skirt and this is the sleeve where we had to stitch the small dot and go down the remaining of the underarm seam. So this is that dot. I matched it up to the dot on my skirt, and I just moved my seam allowance to one side. I started at the dot, so you can see here, I went a little past my dot there, so I need to clean that up. Make sure that you stop directly at your dot. So you move your seam allowance to one side and start at one dot, and then work your way around, starting and stopping, moving your seam allowance over. So go ahead and finish your seam, and then we will move on to the last step. Okay, I made the adjustment to my seam, so I made sure that I stopped right at the dot, and this is the underarm to the sleeve, and this is the skirt. So you can see it's a lot cleaner. Again, just make sure that you're stopping and starting right at your dot. Another closer look at how I finished off that seam. I decided to put a clip to the circle. Make sure you don't clip through it, just to it. And I did that just to kind of relax the seam a little bit, since it's right. It has the sleeve and the skirt connected. I wanted to just relax it a little bit. So I can press this flat here. So this is how I ended up finishing it in this area. The last thing for us to do is to do a narrow hem on our skirt. So on the hem, you will fold up 5/8 of an inch. You will press that in place. You open it out and fold in the raw edge to the fold, and then fold over again and give that a press. Once you have that pressed, you can stitch it, and you are all done with your dress.
Well, that is all for the video. I really do hope that you enjoyed it. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. If you have any questions, leave them down below, and I will see you in the next video. Blessings, everyone. Bye.